when IVF first came into existence, I think the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, what was that, 1984, I think. But anyway, in the 80s, all the states in Australia held inquiries into the implications of this new technique. And one of the dominant findings and recommendations was this: whatever you do not allow freezing of embryos. Don't do it. You're buying an ethical nightmare. And they just went and did it anyway. And so you end up with—
Why was that, David? Was that just because of utilitarianism? Was it?
I can't read their motives, but in a way, it's just out of goodwill of wanting to have an efficient service. And if you don't really think that embryos matter, then, to that extent, then there's no great ethical problem. But
you were saying back in the 1980s, though, they recognised this would be a problem, and they said don't freeze them. That's extraordinary. I didn't know that. I don't think the public knows that this was foreseen when we first embarked on this journey.
I think it was the Dimmock Review in Queensland, if I've got his name right. But see, this is my early dawn of awareness of all these matters. And it was actually a bill in 1986 where Senator Harradine, the late beloved Senator Brian Harradine of Tasmania, drew our attention to this. They were wanting to get permission to experiment on IVF embryos. Now, there's a beautiful insight in the Senate committee report from 1986. Let me quote it to you. They said this:
please do.
The concept of guardianship of the embryo, the concept of guardianship should be adopted as the most appropriate model to indicate the respect due to the embryo. Isn't that brilliant? Again, it's keeping this little semi-artificial creation who's sitting there in a lab still part of the human family. The parents, the adults, the society are still guardians, not owners, not experimenters. We are guardians. So that was quite an insight from 1986. And it stayed the case right through to the stem cell cloning era of the early 2000s, that it was prohibited to experiment on human embryos, prohibited by the National Health Medical Research Council, Ethics Council.
Well, this is important, David, because we went from saying we're going to go down the IVF path in the 1980s, but we shouldn't allow the embryos to be frozen. That was discarded. Then we got to the early 2000s, and we suddenly found we've got all these frozen embryos stored in laboratories all over Australia. And you'll remember this debate very well because John Howard was involved when he was Prime Minister. You were one of the key people advocating for the rights of human life. But our federal parliament had a conscious vote, and they agreed to allow these embryos, which originally in 1986 we said shouldn't be allowed to be frozen. Now we're trying to deal with the consequences. They allowed them through a parliamentary vote to be flushed down the sinks of laboratories. And that's before we get to the cloning and experimental debate that you were just about to touch on.